Samsara, the first season. The Golden Glow, Volume 1, Book 1, by J. L. Martin. Narrator, Marianne Delaforce. What if you could remember a past life? Or worse, what if you couldn't? Born in 1875 and raised in a Scottish orphanage, Abigail is about to turn 15, an age where she will be cast out of the only home she's ever known, no matter how horrid. The day before she is forced to leave behind the only life she has known to enter an uncertain future, a mysterious wooden box arrives, requesting she travel to London to meet with a lawyer by the name of Henry Malcolm. Abigail is catapulted into a world she is fearful of, while events from the past of which she has no control or influence could change the course of her life in ways she never expected. A reluctant journey taking her across the ocean to Melbourne, Australia, sees friendships formed that will last a lifetime, but leaves Abigail even more confused by the aura she has seen since she could first remember. Surprised by the golden glow surrounding many of the new souls she meets along the way, she feels inexplicably drawn to them and a connection she cannot understand or explain. Only to find the further she travels from home, the more common they become, leaving her determined to find out just what they mean, no matter what the cost. The new Australian series, Samsara, the first season, spanning from 1890 to 1968, from bestseller author J. L. Martin, comprises 12 big novels and several spin-offs. Be swept back in time and take the journey with Abigail and the cast of characters you will come to love as family, as they navigate their lives through tragedy and triumphs in this mix of historical and reincarnation fiction with a twist of the supernatural. Hannah Cross. J. L. Martin transports you to a faraway place full of wonder, awe and mystery. I've been here from the start, cheering, laughing and crying, along with Abigail and her family. I was getting so caught up in the flurry of words that hours passed by before I realised it. I have never been so abruptly taken by a book that I can literally feel myself living in Abigail's time and experiencing her life through her words, feeling like I'm right there with her. Each book will take you to a new place full of life, love, and some unfortunate circumstances. You will laugh and cry and learn to love Abigail and her golden glow more than you ever thought you could. Don't hesitate. You won't regret it. Here are the first 3 chapters of The Golden Glow for you to enjoy. Disclaimer. In reading the series Samsara, I ask you to consider the era in which this work of fiction is set. In these more enlightened times, elements of this story may be considered homophobic or morally corrupt, along with barbaric and downright ignorant. However, in 19th century Australia, they were not. Themes throughout the series are reflective of the times and are a current account of the attitude and bias a large majority of society held towards the LGBTQ community. In saying this, we no longer consider it appropriate for a 15-year-old girl to marry, forced or not, but 130 years ago it was not uncommon. The character of Leo is based on a real person. As outrageous, inappropriate and politically incorrect as he is, I love this soul. It is not my intention to stigmatise him or cause offence to anyone, only to remain authentic in my best effort to honour and immortalise a very dear man who left a significant imprint on my life, and who unfortunately was born without a filter and lacks all sensibilities and can be very, very badly behaved. Although most of the buildings in this series did at one time exist, some still stand to this day. The author has taken creative liberties regarding some locations, floor plans, and design. A few scenes may disturb some readers throughout the series and include adult content and low-level violence. She came from nowhere. She belonged to no one. Well, that was what she believed, a belief reinforced daily by the sisters around her. However, some knew this was far from the truth, choosing to remain silent for their own sake. The unusually tall, slender girl emerged from an old stone barn, the heavy bucket she carried filled with water, while she held a scrubbing brush in her hand along with a bar of tallow soap, the skin on her hands appearing raw and painful. Her wavy red hair swung around her waist in 2 long plaits, while a blinding golden light surrounded her body and radiated from every part of her. It was not something anyone around the young woman could see, nor was she even aware the aura was there. But she had met people surrounded by a golden glow, only she had no understanding of what it meant. She wore a calico bonnet, the ill-fitting, threadbare dress providing very little warmth as she shivered while trudging up through the mud towards the back entrance of what once was a private estate of a wealthy aristocrat. The orphanage, a dilapidated 3-story manor, surrounded by 12-foot-high stone walls built 2 centuries ago, sat on a substantial plot of land. The sisters kept chickens and sheep, along with pigs and goats, and an old horse named Tipple. Several cows produced milk for the children. Only half of the manor was in use, as the orphanage survived on charity bestowed on them from local parish donations. Barely enough to feed the children, let alone keep the manor from falling into disrepair. The young girl reached the door, placing the bucket on the ground before sighing deeply. She lifted her arm to rub her shoulder for a moment, before straightening up and narrowing her brilliant emerald green eyes in amusement at a goat who raced across the yard, having escaped its enclosure, while making no move to chase after the beast. She flinched for a moment as her mind returned to the fact that tomorrow, January 14th, 1890, she would turn 15 and would be pushed out into the world from the only home she had ever known. She would leave without knowing the answer to hundreds of questions that had tormented her since she could remember. To be thrown out without kith or kin, knowing not a soul in the world beyond the walls that loomed above, frightened her to the core. She would leave without the security or comfort of knowing where she would go or what would become of her. The poor child had lain awake at night for months now, wondering how she would find the strength and courage to step out into a world she'd been sheltered from her entire life, protected by these walls that she hated so much. She pushed the heavy door open before picking up her bucket and tools, making her way into the dark, wide hallway, continuing on until she arrived at the other end of the enormous building. She set down the pail of water near the front entrance, groaning loudly before sinking to her knees and picking up the scrubbing brush, knowing the sooner she started, the quicker she would finish. As she scrubbed the flagstones in the dimly lit hallway for the last time, she reflected on a past she did know all too well. She had lived all her life at Emiliani House in Edinburgh, Scotland, so named for St. Jerome Emiliani, the patron saint of abandoned children, and the order to which the sisters belonged. In the winter of 1875, she was discovered on the doorstep in a wicker basket. The tiny infant was wrapped in a blanket with a note inside, asking the sisters to look after her and rear the child well, citing her mother had no means to care for a newborn. As if written as an afterthought, scrawled at the bottom of the expensive paper was one sentence stating the child had been named Abigail. However, they had not bestowed a surname on the poor wretch. While eavesdropping on the sisters when she was 7 years of age, Abigail had discovered that she was no more than a few hours old when they had found her, was blue from the cold, and if left outside much longer, surely would have died that night. The sisters had suspiciously noted that her clothing, blanket, and bonnet were expensive, and she wore an emerald stone on a gold chain around her tiny neck. The sisters removed the precious stone immediately, and along with the clothes, stored them away for safekeeping. Abigail never having laid eyes on it in all the years since she had lived there. That was all the poor child knew about how her life began. The sisters, known throughout Scotland to take in unwanted girls, providing them with an adequate education, including instructing them how to behave, were hard taskmasters. They were expected to equip them with household skills that would stand them in good stead when they were of age to go into service for wealthy employers. The sisters ran a tight ship, not allowing for luxuries of any kind. When Abigail was old enough to question the world, she often wondered if this came more from punitiveness than poverty. The mother house was in Inverness, where Mother Superior Mary Bernadette resided with the postulants and retired sisters. As the head of the order, it was her responsibility to oversee the orphanage finances and operation and send replacement sisters to teach and rear the children. The children saw her only during her annual visits, much to their relief. She terrified most of the orphans with her wide mouth and flat nose. They laughed and made fun of her behind her back, comparing her to a toad that had let the power she held go to her head. As Abigail grew, it became evident to the sisters that she was an exceptionally bright child. She could read by the age of 3, knew all her letters and numbers, and could count beyond 100. What did bother them was she spoke with an English accent, despite rarely venturing beyond the orphanage walls and never having met a soul from England. Sister Mary Josephine became the closest thing to a mother the poor child had, and she loved her without limitations. She nurtured her accordingly, often holding Abigail on her lap as she sat on her rickety old bed while reading to her and the other girls in their dormitory at night. She had slept in the nursery from the night Abigail arrived, and then set up her bed in the dormitory for several years until she felt the child would not fret if she were not nearby. Surreptitiously, the kind-hearted sister had begun providing her with books she found in a musty library in the unused portion of the manor, but on occasion presented her with new books she was able to obtain from an unknown source, whom she refused to identify still to this day. These books stimulated Abigail's mind, but most of all her imagination. By the time she was 12, she was reading the works of great philosophers and poets, art and history books, and anything else she could get her hands on, such as novels by Jane Austen and Elizabeth Gaskell. She loved the small tattered books with stories using language that was new and exciting to her, her inquisitive mind searching for words she could add to her vocabulary, while trying to understand the works of Charles Dickens and William Shakespeare. The books Sister Mary Josephine managed to find confirmed in Abigail's mind that there was a vibrant world beyond the orphanage walls, and that had given her hope that one day she would have a life of her own, free from the harsh upbringing she had endured to date in this lifetime. As I scrubbed the stone floor, one I had cleaned 1,000 times during my lifetime, I giggled softly at a memory of my dear friend Polly, who would complain from start to finish when ordered to scrub anything, while I wondered what tomorrow would bring. I heard footsteps drawing nearer, and I raised my head, my eyes slowly adjusting to the dim light. Sister Mary Josephine hurried along the hallway as if she had lost something, stopping several times to look on top of numerous sideboards that stood against the wall, the paint peeling and yellowed, while several large cracks wound their way up the walls and across the ceiling. She looked beautiful in her black habit as she swished down the corridor, her rosary beads swinging from her pocket. When she noticed me in the alcove, she glanced across lovingly, then hurried to my side, coming to an abrupt halt in front of me before reaching down and gently patting me on the head. "Get up, Chad. I'm eager to speak with you." She patiently waited for me to set aside my brush, rag, and bucket, so no one passing by would trip over them. I rose to my feet and followed her into the large parlour at the front of the manor, passing through the dim and shabby entrance. The smell of old leather filled my nose, the room musty with dust floating in the air, illuminated by the light filtering through 2 large windows. The room was rarely used, and then only when our parish priest, Father McLean, visited to partake in afternoon tea with the sisters. "My lord, have you given any more thought about entering the convent?" She gazed at me, her striking blue eyes filled with genuine concern. She was a beautiful, sweet and loving person, and the only mother I had ever known. "Yes, sister, and no, sister," I answered. "It is not my calling. You know me better than I know myself. Deep down, you know I would never be happy in a convent. I cannot commit to a life serving a God that I do not believe in as you do." I was surprisingly calm, albeit defiant, as I felt I must be honest with her along with myself. There is also the fact I see strange things that you believe are not of God. She fixed me with a hard stare, then shook her head disapprovingly. Shut your mouth. Anybody may hear, and 'tis blasphemous. She frowned, an expression that I rarely saw, although even that could not dim her beauty, due to the golden glow that surrounded her and made her appear like an angel sent down from heaven. I would never argue with her, and always did as she told me, but this time was different. I wanted more for myself than was being offered. I had always been determined, despite some of the sisters trying to scalp it out of me. I did not know what would happen to me tomorrow. However, I did know what I did not want my life to become. I moved towards the Chase Lounge that was tattered and had seen better days before sitting down and waiting for her to continue. She sat beside me, placing her hand on my cheek, then shook her head at me again. You have always been so free with your opinions, Abigail, but I have to tell you you will have to try harder to curb your tongue when you're in service, or you will end up on the streets. It keeps me awake at night, leaving me tossing and turning till dawn, a multitude of thoughts running through my mind, none of them pleasant. And I'm worried over what will ultimately become of you, McGray. Tears filled her gentle, clear blue eyes that stared into mine, unblinking and so full of emotion as a deep, profound sadness settled on her face. She held my hands tightly between her own, and I forced a smile, hoping to cheer her, despite having the same dark concerns myself. I have asked Sister Mary Monica about where you will go tomorrow. She telling me she's awaiting to hear from a wealthy family in New York that may need a new scullery made. If this happens, your future will be assured, and the burden taken from me. It hurts my heart, and I cannot do any more for you. A tear escaped her eye that she quickly brushed away, appearing flushed and emotional, her hands trembling slightly. You have done everything and more. I swallowed hard, willing the lump in my throat to disappear, but failed miserably, my eyes starting to fill with tears. You are the only person I have in this world that truly loves me and cares I'm alive, and I do thank your God for giving you to me. I was discarded without a backward glance, no different than a piece of scaffy, and you made me feel valuable and worthy. You have been more of a mother than a nun to me, and I will always love you. I do not know why, sister, but I believe there is something good out there in this world for me. I promise you I will find it and not disappoint you. I will always remember and be grateful for all you have done for me. The nights you came to tuck me in and kiss me, always gently speaking with me and encouraging me to be a kind person, no matter what my circumstance. You always made sure I did a good deed before a bad one, and guided me, so I never have to live with regrets. Then there are the wonderful books you brought to me out of pure love. You taught me how to be the person I am. I couldn't have asked for a better mother than you. I burst into tears and let my body crumple into her side, placing my head on her shoulder while I sobbed. She slipped her arms around me and stroked my hair, while gently rubbing my cheek. Oh, my Lord. She dug into her habit and pulled out a linen handkerchief, quickly wiping her eyes and then mine, before smiling sadly. I feel a part of me will be leaving with you. You're such a special wee child to me, and you're the closest I will ever have to a daughter of my own. You have always been so strong-willed and always know your own mind, always reading, absorbing everything. You could never let me down or disappoint me, Abigail. No, ever. No matter what choices you make in life, good, bad, or stupid, or if you make decisions that lead you straight up that evil path to the gates of hell, I will still love you. I am ever so proud of you, me girl, and I know
You will be sensible, whatever your choices. Whatever happens, I would like you to write to me when you can.
I promise. I sniffed, then blew my nose loudly into her handkerchief, feeling overwhelmed with grief at the thought of parting from her forever. She hugged me tightly as I cried onto her shoulder for what seemed like the longest time. She was such a pretty woman, short and plump with big blue eyes. I knew she had brown curly hair under that wimple, which I had discovered during a night when I was taken ill with fever a few years back, and with a nightcap on her head she had rushed to my bedside. Her hair was fighting to get free from under the cap, and it was winning, its tight curls pushing their way out so I could see them for the first time since I had known her. She was in her 3rd decade now, and had been almost a child herself when I was taken in, only residing at the orphanage for a few weeks before my arrival. She often told me I had a memory like an elephant. If I read or experienced something once, it was etched in my mind forever, just waiting to be called upon at some inappropriate moment, causing me to be chastised by many of the sisters 1,000 times over who were not so fond of me. Sister Mary Agnes was well known for her sharp tongue and quick temper. I had been fortunate to have Sister Mary Josephine love and care for me, and more importantly, protect me, as some sisters dislike children immensely. As Sister Mary Josephine embraced me, my mind filled with powerful memories of how she had loved and protected me during my childhood, which I would not have survived without her intervention.
Sister Mary Monica wants to see you, she said at last. I have been sent for you. Please mind your tongue when you meet with her, McGray, as she's your last hope of finding somewhere to go. You know very well that if you upset her, she will likely push you out the front gates tomorrow herself, leaving you on the streets. Hurry up now. She says 'tis of an urgent nature.
She released me from her tight embrace and helped me to my feet before making our way out of the parlour. We walked side by side down the long hallway towards Sister Mary Monica's office before I stopped suddenly and embraced her again.
You will always be the mother I would have chosen for myself,
I whispered as she broke down and wept openly while hugging me tightly in return. Sister Mary Josephine managed to compose herself before knocking on the office door. "Enter," I heard in a sharp tone. She turned the brass handle and held the heavy door wide for me as I took several tentative steps before stopping in front of the authoritarian nun. The latter stood by the door, eyeing me with disdain, while Sister Mary Josephine remained outside the door. "Sit down," she barked, causing me to jump in fright before hurrying to the worn leather chair and sitting down heavily. I gazed around the room and observed once more how shabby and neglected it was. A wooden desk with broken corner, some shelving behind it in disrepair, stood in the middle of the room. The smooth plaster that once lined the walls was missing in large patches and exposed solid bluestone walls. A worn leather-upholstered chair stood behind a faded desk, while a sideboard held a crystal decanter and 4 sparkling glasses that glittered in the light that streamed through the window. They had been on the cabinet ever since I could remember, having spent a lot of time in this office due to being wilful, as the sisters politely called it. I realised I had never seen them moved. I assumed their only purpose was for when Father McLean visited. He was a hard man, and the children avoided him at all costs. The bookshelves behind the desk bulged with many tomes, mostly ecclesiastical works that I was certain I would have found loathsome to read. Then there was the gruesome crucifix that took up nearly one whole wall of the room. Whenever summoned to this office, it had always frightened me. I found it extremely disturbing having to stare at a life-sized Jesus with blood dripping down his beastly wounds inflicted by evil people.
"Thank you, Sister Mary Josephine. You may go."
Sister Mary Monica ordered my beloved sister, who nodded politely and quietly closed the door behind her. Sister Mary Monica appeared puzzled as she strolled past me and around her desk to sit in the imposing chair.
"These books arrived for you this morning."
She stabbed her pudgy finger in the air several times at a wooden object on her desk, screwing up her face in disdain, the grey glow that surrounded her body only making her appear even eviler than I believed her to be.
"It contains some interesting documents. I did not consider it to be in your best interest that ye are informed of their contents, but I had no choice in the matter. This could significantly impact your future, scabby basser, and I expect you to take this seriously. You are not to treat it as a joke as you dare with everything else,"
she added, the contempt in her eyes clear as she glared at me, while I observed what seemed to be a very expensive-looking wooden container in front of her and ignored her hostility. She had never liked me, and I was certain she was thrilled each time I was sent to her to be flogged for misbehaving, which was usually just for opening my mouth with an opinion. I began to ponder what she was saying and questioning but trying to disguise. Why would anyone take the time or effort to make inquiries regarding an irrelevant and unwanted girl like me? I wondered what it could be about, as these things usually ended up in ways you did not want or expect. I felt nausea overcome me. My insides started to shake, while my heart pounded so hard it thundered in my ears. I had no time to recover before she continued.
"First of all, there's a document in here naming you as Abigail Delmont. If ye are connected in any way to that Isabel Delmont, the devil's own blood is running through your veins. She never had the right to even use that name, the maleficent trollop. I should have reverted to Howard decades ago."
She spat before regaining her composure, while I stared at her in confusion.
"It gives the name of your mother, a Mary Campbell, a hedge creeper na dat, and your father's nae listed at all, as I have always suspected. This strumpet Mary is likely spawned from Isabel somehow. Important information if you plan to find this family you think you know have. A family I would be ashamed of if the truth be known. Did you think you will seek them out, you scabby basser?"
She glared across the desk, her eyes silently challenging me. She was such a spiteful cow, and clearly resented any news I might obtain about my family or where I came from, which she knew full well was vital to me and always had been. I paused, needing time to get over my shock and disbelief.
I don't know,"
I finally stammered. I felt dizzy. It quickly dawned on me that, if true, I had a surname and parents who had finally been identified. I could belong somewhere and be part of a real family now, or at least in the very near future. The realization sent pure happiness surging through my entire body, even as I sat in the office, overcome with fear. That fear now mingled with a growing sense of excitement.
"Well, you have to remember that he left you here for a reason, and that likely reason 'tis they didn't want anything to do with you in the first place."
She simpered, blood rising to my face, while my stomach felt as if she had struck me.
"It will cause you much distress and heartbreak should you go and find them, and to find that they had started new lives without you would be wretched for you."
She stopped for a moment and smiled to herself.
"They obviously didn't want to be in contact with you, or they would have returned at some point over the years to claim you, but they never did. No. Mark my words, you wee basser, you're better off to get on with your own life and go into service for a nice family that will look after you into your old age."
She paused to let her words sink in, causing me to sit back as if she had slapped me.
"You could consider dedicating yourself to God. 'Tis nae a bad life here. You work hard from dawn till dusk to make sure the bairns have what they need. Though we have fallen on hard times in the 15 years since we lost our benefactors, may they burn in hell. and then our kirk closed and it became attached to the larger parish. We are scraping by, trying to ensure churlish lasses like you have a chance in life. No, you obtuse blackguard, if you want to stay here, you would have to shut that big mouth of yours. You're more than aware we spend 4 hours a day in silent contemplation and prayer. It would be very hard on you should you ever join the order, as you are a disobedient ingrate who dinna believe that will make anything of yourself. I am of a strong belief that you should not look for your parents, and they dinna want you then, and they will not want you now. Didn't forget, they left you here to be raised in poverty. They didn't care about you and never did.
She spat with icy contempt as a smile faded from my face, while her lips started to turn up into an insidious smile, appearing to take great pleasure from my confusion and pain. My heart sank. Maybe Sister Mary Monica was right. Perhaps they would not want anything to do with me if I just turned up and disrupted their lives.
The second document, she continued briskly, is a letter addressed to me, instructing that I hand you this sealed envelope, ensure all instructions are followed.
She deliberately hesitated before passing the envelope across the desk, prolonging the suspense. I reached over and politely took the letter with a shaking hand, avoiding her gaze. As I held it between my fingers, the beautiful paper smooth and crisp, I noticed it was of a quality I had never had the privilege to use, or even lay eyes on before. I slowly broke the wax seal and started to open it, realizing this was the first letter of my own I had ever received, only reinforcing the fact I did not have anyone in the world other than Sister Mary Josephine who even cared if I lived or died. Inside, I found a £5 note, a train ticket, and a message directed to me personally, written by an experienced and creative hand of some education. £5 was as much as I would have earned in a year slaving away as a maid for some entitled and often cruel master, and more money than I thought I would ever see at once. Yet here I was, holding it in my hand. I was amazed that someone out there, someone cared enough to send it to me. I scanned the brief message before passing the letter and money back to Sister Mary Monica, who was holding out her hand expectantly to read the contents herself. I had never held money before, and it felt good. So it was with reluctance that I handed it back to her. Money meant freedom and choice, and that was what I wanted. I was well aware that I would never fit in or be just ordinary. I was a female, alone, and I struggled to bite my tongue and comply without question. Not how women were expected to behave, especially in service where you were required to be submissive and agreeable. Every waking moment. I watched in amusement as Sister Mary Monica's face darkened, appearing even more unimpressed as she read the note. She grimaced before she placed it on one side of the desk and stared at me intently.
I heard back only yesterday from a family in York who has kindly offered you employment as a scullery maid on their estate.
She looked up from the letter she was reading and narrowed her gaze across the desk.
Surely you're bright enough to know you would be better off taking this position on the chance this solicitor, Mr. Malcolm, and his motives are inauspicious. Why has this arrived only the day for you to leave here forever? I must say, thank goodness you be leaving in the morrow. I personally will be celebrating seeing the back of you. The Lord God has finally answered my prayers. After reading these documents several times, we had no idea what this is about. Who is behind it, or what could happen to you travelling to London all alone, not knowing if there will be anybody on the other end waiting for you? Not that I care, but we do have Sister Mary Josephine to consider, who has openly favoured you the entire time we was forced to tolerate your existence. I am well aware of how concerned she is for your welfare, and that she is favoured and protected by Mother Mary Bernadette. Therefore, I must ensure that you're at least safe on the day you leave here. What happens to you after that is none of my concern.
I felt the bitterness that dripped from her voice as I held her stony gaze. She would never want or expect anything good to happen to me. And now it appeared I might have a slim chance of finding my parents. It was apparent how much she disapproved and resented this turn of events.
May I have permission to leave, please, sister? I would like to be alone to consider what this all means. I now have another option other than going into slavery for the rest of my natural life,
I whispered defiantly, my voice faltering as I tried to resist the urge to cry, before leaning back in my chair and crossing my arms. She pursed her lips, her eyes glinting dangerously.
Oh, so it seems you will not be needing a scholarly position then. You above that kind of work now, are you? Why, you just 'cause some solicitor in London wants to see you. Has it made you feel important for the first time in your pitiful life?
She scoffed, attempting to humiliate me, a place she consistently went to when not winning an argument, or the rare times when those brave enough would refuse to obey her without question. I shook my head a little too vigorously.
No, I will not accept the position until I've had time to myself, to consider my future. But please thank them for their kind offer of employment.
She widened her eyes in disbelief before grunting loudly, her face a mottled red. Whatever was going to happen, I believed it could not be worse than working 18 hours or more a day, and it was pure luck if your master was decent and you were fortunate to have a kind employer. Even then, those in service worked from dawn till dusk carrying out the most menial and back-breaking tasks, then falling into bed to only have to rise hours later to do it all over again. If my parents did not want me, I had already decided to use the £5 to book passage to France and see for myself the things that I had only read and dreamed of while shivering in my bed on those cold winter nights that seemed to go on forever. If Paris turned out to be all I expected, I would seek employment there, find a decent job that was interesting and that I enjoyed doing. I could make new friends and start a new life, one I could choose for myself.
It says in the letter that you would be collected at the end of the train journey at London Station, and to taken to your lodging for a meeting with that solicitor the following day. Have you considered the genuine risk of getting stranded in such a dangerous city, with no hope of work or help if this comes to naught?
She grimaced as she had just sucked on a sour sweetie, her displeasure evident.
I will take my chances, sister.
I continued to hold her gaze as she grunted again, then shifted in her worn leather chair. I wanted to be alone to think about what all this meant for me. I knew that I was risking nothing by taking the train, a new experience for me, given I had rarely gone beyond the walls of the convent since arriving all those years ago. I felt I would regret it forever if I did not find out what the solicitor wanted, and any information he may hold regarding my family, reigniting my longing to find my parents. Now there was a glimmer of hope, no matter how small, and I planned to take it with both hands and claim my birthright. I would go, and nothing was going to stop me. Especially not this matchet-mouthed bitch, who may have been married to Jesus, but only behaved as a Christian woman when people were watching. I walked back to the sparse dormitory I shared with 19 other girls, from my age down to 4 years old, finding someone had neatly placed a calico bag on the end of my bed to pack my possessions in. I picked it up and felt the rough cloth, neatly sewn by the sisters, with a strap that slipped over your shoulder. I took several steps towards my side drawer and took out a brown woolen shawl and set it aside, my only warm winter outerwear, knitted for me by Sister Mary Josephine, with love. I placed one of the 2 new dresses the sisters had allowed me to make for the outside world, smoothing the coarse fabric down neatly as I looked around the empty room. I had copied the styles out of a magazine retrieved from a scaffy pile while walking home through the village from church one Sunday. Big hats were in fashion, but I did not own a hat or even know how to make one, so I would have to wear my bonnet when I left tomorrow, if only to appease the sisters. I had every intention of throwing it on the street as soon as I arrived at the station and not looking back. I did not like hats anyway, so I was more than happy to sacrifice wearing one, despite the fact I would not fit into a society that was brand new to me and where being accepted was important. The dresses I had sewn were high in the neck with slim sleeves, a tiny cinched-in waist, and folds of material falling to the ground like a bell surrounding me. One was a deep brown that complemented my hair, the other a dark emerald green that I found lovely. I would be able to wear them and blend into the crowd, despite the fact I was not a gifted seamstress. Both were modestly styled and decent enough to walk down the street and not stand out, which was the last thing I wanted. I hated being the centre of attention, finding when people stared at me, it made me self-conscious. The dresses might not have been the height of fashion, but they were new, and they were grown up, which was all I wanted. I stood by the bed, gazing at myself in the tiny hand mirror Sister Mary Josephine had smuggled to me, given that mirrors were not permissible for girls in a Catholic orphanage, should they encourage the sin of vanity. My eyes seemed overly large, and my dark long lashes made them look so much older than they were. Despite having been shut away in an orphanage, I had read far too much of how cruel and unfair the world I was about to enter could be. A world I was cynical about, and that frightened me a great deal. The most important thing to me was finding my parents and belonging to someone, knowing I would find peace only once I discovered where I came from and who my people were. I needed to look at tomorrow as the start of an adventure and a day closer to them holding me in their arms. I lay in bed with 1,000 thoughts running through my mind. I would die if my life turned out to be mundane. If my fate were to do the same things over and over every day like the sisters or as a servant, I would wither inside and lose hope and end up as bitter and twisted as Sister Mary Monica. No. My life would have meaning, and no matter how poor I was, I promised myself that I would find joy in every situation. I did not know how, but things would work out, especially when I was reunited with my parents. I turned my thoughts to Sister Mary Josephine, and suddenly my heart hurt. I was miserable. I would never forget her for the rest of my life. I'd been fortunate enough to acquire a miniature portrait of her taken several years ago by a photographer who had come to the orphanage to take a picture of all the sisters for a newspaper article. His visit had been the cause of great jovial banter between them as they practiced their poses. Sister Mary Josephine had slipped it to me during our hallway embrace, and I had added it to my meagre possessions in my calico bag. I felt ready to face tomorrow and accept my fate, whatever that may be, knowing I had one special person in the world who would always love me unconditionally, even though we would be physically separated, possibly forever. I settled down on the hard, rickety single bed and pulled my threadbare blanket up to my neck, my body shivering for a time until sleep engulfed me. I dreamed of a ship, a dark cellar, and Paris. But darker dreams crept in as the night drew deeper on towards morning, leaving me tossing and turning while they tormented me to the very core of my soul. Chapter 2. The pale light filtered through the cracked pane glass window as I turned over before slowly opening my eyes, feeling excitement mixed with fear start to well up inside me, knowing this was the first day of my new life, whatever direction it may take. As I lay in my uncomfortable, creaky bed for a moment longer and listened to the winter birds singing their morning chorus, I realised that today would be a day of lasts. The last time I would hear the birds chirping from outside, perched up in the oak tree that had grown for over 100 years outside the dormitory window. The last time I would see all the children I had watched grow alongside me. The last time I would be in the presence of the sisters. The last time I would have a safe and secure roof over my head, a home, no matter how lonely or void of love, to live in that I did not have to pay for myself. The last time I would be a child, for today I would be thrown out into the world I was unfamiliar with and expected to behave as an adult, no matter how my tender years. I tossed off the blanket and rose quickly.
This is the last time I will get out of this bed. Thank the sisters God.
I mumbled to myself. The ancient, squeaky structure made of cast iron that had rusted long ago. The mattress so thin I could feel the hard base underneath, would not be missed by my aching back. There were some laughs that I was relieved I would never experience again, and I smiled to myself. I quickly stepped into my new green dress, my thin shift underneath, and secured the tiny buttons one by one up to my neck, then slipped on my new shoes. The sisters provided a new pair of boots the day before leaving the orphanage to carry you through until you commenced employment and could pay for your own necessities. It was an extraordinary feeling to have new shoes, and we were provided with one pair every year that had to last, even if our feet grew. The sisters would cut out the toes of the shoes or boots for children whose feet grew too quickly, if a used pair in their size was unavailable. As I grew, I seemed to always have the toes cut out, leaving my feet dangling over the edge by the middle of the year. I hated my enormous feet. All the sisters had tiny feet, but then I stood a full head taller than most of them. These new boots fitted me perfectly, and although not fashionable, they were undoubtedly serviceable and quite comfortable. I smoothed the blanket into place on the bed, then placed my bag on my small table before making my way to the dining hall, where I had eaten every day for most of my life. It was a vast space containing tables and bench seats, with no effort or thought to provide a comfortable or attractive environment for the children to enjoy their meals. It was clean and efficient, but far from homey, no different than the rest of the orphanage. The sisters did their best with what they had, but there was no money ever left over for anything other than essentials. I crossed the room to collect my breakfast from the elderly cook, making my way over to an empty table, where I could eat alone before sitting down to a barely warm bowl of porridge with lumps. The gluggy consistency and gluey taste often caused me to gag, but I would force it down, given my limited options. I was accustomed to terrible food, eating it without another thought while daydreaming. I mindlessly gazed up at the high ceiling and the intricate stonework on the walls and floors of the dining room. I wondered what the room would have looked like in all its glory, imagining flag-draped walls flanking an enormous table groaning with exotic foods eaten by cavaliers and fine ladies, while a string quartet played in the background, filling the room with beautiful music. I looked around at the other children in the room, some young, while others closer to my age. It would hurt my heart to say goodbye to them all today. Even though the younger ones sometimes annoyed me, and those near my age did not have a lot in common with me, I still felt a sense of fond attachment, safety, and belonging, being amongst others in the same situation as me. My one and only friend Polly had left the orphanage more than a year before me. We had been like sisters our entire lives, growing up side by side. They had placed us in the nursery together for our first 3 years with the other babies, and we had slept in the same cot. Polly was a year older than me, but because the sisters could see the bond between us, and poor Polly was small for her age and sickly, they allowed her to remain with me until she was 4. They could not see the golden glow that surrounded Polly, although I never spoke of auras to anyone as I matured, given the reactions I received when I was too young to understand it was a dangerous topic. Talking of it placed me at risk of being accused by zealous religious followers of being a witch, or even worse, the spawn of the devil. When the time came to move to the larger, colder dormitory where the older children slept, our beds were placed next to each other, and we became inseparable. The sisters would tease that if they saw one of us, the other would arrive shortly thereafter. I would help Polly with her writing and numbers, as she found it challenging to keep up with the other children during our lessons. At night, as we lay in our beds, I would teach her to count and go through her letters with her, then move on to spelling, explaining the meaning of all the new words we were obligated to learn, and some I had discovered myself through my love of reading. As we grew, we would talk about the things I had read in books, which we tried to imagine. It seemed as probable as going to the moon for it to be true that there were candleless lights, and that you could turn on a tap and hot water would come out through pipes into a bath, along with the fact that some wealthy people had inside privies that flushed their sewage out. I assumed to some unknown pit below. It seemed like you would have to be royalty to have anything like that in your home. With no one in the outside world who cared what happened to us, we felt lucky to have a roof over our heads, no matter how often it leaked. When we were supposed to be sleeping, Polly and I would whisper to each other in the dark about the boys we would see at Kirk, arguing over who had the loveliest smile, wondering who we would marry, and dreaming how our lives would be perfect. We fantasized about eating whenever and whatever we liked, and dreamed of smooth, sweet, hot porridge that I had read about in books. We told each other everything and were often in trouble together, constantly summoned to Sister Mary Monica's office, where we would be reprimanded and assigned extra chores. At times, depending on what evil we had committed, the punishment included the strap, or cuts as we called it, the skin on your palm lined with bleeding welts by the time she had finished. If a task took the two of us, we would spend the whole time talking and laughing, as Polly had a gift for impersonating the sisters, Father McLean and our gardener, Mr. Potts. She was so gifted she spoke like a proper English woman, having copied my own unexplained accent since we were small. A year ago, the day came that Polly was forced to leave. Sister Mary Monica secured a position for her as a scullery maid near London, and Polly resigned herself to the fact that it was the only option available to her. The sisters advised her in no uncertain terms that it was an excellent opportunity for her to make something of herself and dedicate her life to the service of others. We had spent her final night talking, laughing and crying as we lay huddled together in my bed, remembering our childhood, knowing deep down that we would never see each other again. We promised to write and find each other in the outside world, but we both knew that was unlikely to occur. When I was 5, we swore an oath that when we grew up and left the orphanage behind us, we would live next door to each other and have babies at the same time, who would also grow up to be best friends. It was all we wanted in our hearts, although we knew that real life never turned out as you hoped and dreamed, and we were clinging to a fantasy that would never be within our grasp. Tears trickled down my face as I remembered how we had clung to each other at the bottom of the steps at the entrance to the orphanage, sobbing our hearts out just before she was so brutally ripped away from me. The sisters stood on the stairs watching us, some with stony expressions, while others did appear slightly saddened that we were forced to part. Mr. Potts had come into view, with Tipple pulling the old wooden cart behind him. He pulled gently on the reins as he drew up beside the grand entrance that was once immaculate, the manor hosting kings and queens in its previous life, now looking sad and neglected. He glanced down, his weathered face softening for a brief moment, watching intently as we held each other tightly, and sobbed before straightening up in his seat, mumbling to himself as he gazed out over the fields. He climbed down and picked up Polly's bag without a word and placed it in the back of the cart, then returned to the bench seat, impatiently waiting for her to join him so he could take her to the train station before returning to carry on with his chores. Mr. Potts was not one for human interaction, which was why I always thought he liked working at Emiliani House. He had been here for many long years before I was born and was the oldest person I had ever seen. He was responsible for growing the vegetables and grain, fixing anything broken and in need of repair, along with keeping the outside of the orphanage spick and span, and going into town twice a week to collect the necessities for the sisters. Then, when the time came, he would transport us to the station when we left the orphanage. He had never said more than 2 words to me the entire time I had lived at the orphanage. I often thought he liked working alone and had become so used to it that he had forgotten how to talk and interact with others. As Polly and I clung together that day, with neither wanting to let the other go, Sister Mary Josephine had hurried down the stairs and gently whispered,
"Polly has to lead now. Let go each other, girls, before the sisters become impatient with you."
Then she had pried our arms apart and ordered Polly into the cart while holding on to me, so I would not follow. Polly slowly pulled herself up and sat next to Mr. Potts, her black hair gleaming as she placed her head in her hands for a moment, then turning to me, hiccuping and crying, calling out that she loved me and would somehow find me again in this lifetime. I would never forget the sound of her sobbing. Her heartbroken wails often filled my ears while I slept. I was so overwhelmed with grief, knowing our friendship was lost to me forever, that I couldn't speak or say anything back to her. As they passed through the large gates and disappeared, it physically hurt my heart. For the first time in my life, I knew what it was like to lose a person you truly loved. I had decided after losing her, I would never again allow myself to become close to anyone. I had tried to push Sister Mary Josephine away. However, she would not let me and gently allowed me to love and trust her again, like no other, as I slowly started to recover from my loss as time passed. Once Polly was gone, I immersed myself in every book I could get hold of, terrified of what would become of me when my time came to leave. Now that time was here. What a difference a day could make. While this time yesterday I had been frightened about what would happen to me, I now felt anticipation and excitement, as I knew in my heart, I just knew that I would soon meet my parents. I hurried towards Sister Mary Monica's office, which she had rudely told me to do this morning by sending a note to my table during breakfast, carried by a sweet 5-year-old of whom I had become fond. The door was open as she stood up from her desk and beckoned me inside, appearing to be in a bad mood the moment she set eyes on me, sitting down heavily as I closed the door and waited for her to permit me to sit.
"I take it you had not seen sense and changed your mind."
Her tone was sharp as she glanced at me, waving her hand towards the old leather chair that sat in front of her desk before looking down at a pile of correspondence that required her attention. I tried to smile as I looked back at her suspiciously, shaking my head slightly while she continued to ignore me. I sat down before she reached across and passed me the envelope, with my ticket, the money, and the document that had given me my parents' names, her eyes glittering dangerously.
"You will catch the 9 o'clock train. He'll leave in an hour."
She shook her head in disbelief before sighing deeply, narrowing her gaze before fixing me with a stare.
"Your dear favour Isabel Delmont, and I wouldn't be surprised if you spawned from her lineage. I lay awake most of the night and the morning thinking of it, and the more sense I make of that terrible night you arrived here. A night I continue to try and forget, but it haunts me and likely will till I take my last breath. If in fact it is true you have Isabel's blood, it pleases me greatly, as you have a family curse that will carry you for the rest of your life, 'cause of that woman. What she did to my great-grandfather will never be forgiven or forgotten by anybody who know him, including their descendants, who all despise that sorceress to this day. She now burns in the fires of hell, just as you will."
I sat back in the chair, my eyes wide, as she quickly turned away and gazed out the pane-glass window, clearing her throat. I had no idea who she was referring to, but it sounded like a nasty family feud that, unsurprisingly, she still carried a grudge over. I would not have expected any less from her, given how hateful she was and had always been. Despite attempting to upset me, I knew I could be related to hundreds of people based on my looks and surname alone, and had always been deaf to her opinions.
I knew he was an imp of Lucifer himself, and would bring trouble to our door that night I first saw you in the nursery. And I knew you were the spawn of Pythoness. Me fears were confirmed as soon as you started to talk with an accent not from these parts. If it had been me that found you that execrable night, I would have left you out there for the cold to take you. But Sister Mary Josephine got to you first and has never left you since. You bewitched her that night, you did, and the sooner you leave here, the easier we will all rest.
After what felt like an eternity, she turned back to me, her face showing no emotion.
An hour gives you plenty of time to say your goodbyes to everybody. Arrive at the station shortly before the train is scheduled to leave Edinburgh. The older children and the sisters will say goodbye at the entrance of the orphanage. I hope you're sure about what you're doing, as I am against this path you've chosen, only for the sake of Sister Mary Josephine. But as you pointed out so stubbornly yesterday, it's ultimately your own decision. I wish you the best in your endeavours, and I hope you have fond memories of us wherever you end up.
She showed no emotion and spoke in polite tones as though I was a lost stranger she had just met on the street who had asked for directions. She handed me the little wooden box. I opened it and saw it now contained the tiny gown I had been dressed in when abandoned on the doorstep all those years ago, along with a knitted blanket and a bonnet made from the finest wool. The emerald necklace was nestled amongst the fabric, while the fawn-coloured garment was well preserved and appeared well made. Sister Mary Monica rose to her feet, then stretched out her arm expectantly, waiting for me to kiss her hand. I hesitated only slightly, before standing and politely taking her cold, unattractive fingers in mine, and reluctantly submitting for only a brief moment, pulling away and straightening up while preparing to leave. I would not miss her. The only attention she ever gave me was when barking orders relentlessly, multiple times a day, every day, or punishing me harshly and cruelly, without conscience, over the slightest misdemeanour. Not once had she ever shown me even a drop of kindness, empathy, or compassion. However, this was another last, and one that brought me great joy mingled with relief. I felt an overwhelming sense of satisfaction as I crossed the room, ignoring her as she sat back down behind her desk and picked up a brown ledger. I stepped out into the hallway, leaving her office for the final time, with a small box under my arm and my head held high. I quietly closed the door behind me and did not look back. I slowly made my way down the long hallway towards the nursery, or the weans room as we called it. I had spent my first 3 years in that room, kept in a cot alongside the other infants day and night, except when in need of bathing or a clout change, and when the sisters would take the children outside for an hour on the rare occasion when the sun was shining. When it came time for feeding, the sisters would move from cot to cot, carrying a large ceramic jug with a tiny funnel, pouring warm milk into the babies' mouths. Then once you were a little older and strong enough to stand, you would pull yourself up and hold the railing while the sisters went from cot to cot, spoon-feeding the children from large bowls. More often than not, they were filled with porridge for breakfast and vegetable stew for lunch, and if you were lucky, some unappealing concoction with meat for dinner. I had been fortunate, though. Sister Mary Josephine was one of the sisters assigned to the weans room, and she had taken it upon herself to care for me. She often held me in the crook of her arm as she went about her duties. She had a special fondness for me. She believed, due to the fact she was the one who had found me abandoned at the door of the orphanage. When the time came for me to move to the larger dormitory, Sister Mary Josephine requested a transfer, and permission was reluctantly granted, enabling her to continue to care for me. By the time I turned 10, I was in the weans room each day, picking up the children, playing with them, and watching them grow while helping the sisters care for them. The sisters made it a priority, especially in winter, to keep the nursery warm, much warmer than the rest of the old manor. I would teach the older children words and numbers and tell them stories of distant places that I had only read about. The sisters were glad of my visits and told me often how grateful they were for the help. It gave them time to do other essential chores while I kept those sweet, innocent souls entertained and happy. At times, the younger children annoyed me. A few would come to my bed during the night, seeking comfort when they were having nightmares or had soiled themselves. I always relented and allowed them to sleep with me in my own tiny bed. Although I found it inconvenient and sometimes irksome over the years, it was also something I would dearly miss now. That close, familiar contact with another human being, and the comfort of being surrounded by those in the same situation as myself. I reached the end of the hall and knocked on the thick, imposing door of the weans' room. "Come in." Sister Mary Marian greeted me, then enthusiastically took me by the arm and began addressing me in her typical frenetic fashion.
"There was poor banter in the sisters' quarters last night with the mystery of the London solicitor. Do you have any idea what any of it means?" "Of course you dinna. How could you know? But it's all very titillating, isn't it?" "Aye, certainly is. But you will find out soon enough, that's for sure. We all wish you well, my bonny lass. We all wish you well."
She was tall compared to the other sisters and possessed a plain face, her speech non-stop and rapid. She was never at a loss for words, and I found it hard to imagine how she could be silent for 4 hours a day while in deep prayer and contemplation. Poor Sister Mary Marian possessed ill-fated eyes. One turned outwards, so you never knew which eye was looking at you, or which one to look at when speaking to her, always making me uneasy that I may be staring into the wrong one. Even before the day I was found on the steps, she had worked in the weans' room, and I remembered how kind she had always been to me. She led me over to the 4 newborns that had arrived all within a week of one another. The room was large and warm, with high ceilings and rows of old rickety cots that held one blanket for sometimes 2 children. At least with the newborns, the sisters had placed knitted caps on their tiny heads, and their gowns were made of thick muslin, making it less of an issue that the threadbare blankets barely added to their warmth. I picked up a wee girl with curly black hair and held her in the crook of my arm. She slept peacefully as I kissed her tiny cheek, turning to place her back in the crib gently. None of the newborns had names. Given they were abandoned at the doorstep of the orphanage without identification, and they would not be named until their baptism, which would be held in the next week. I touched each of the infants, silently saying goodbye, then went to the rows of cots to say my farewells to the older babies. I felt so sad that the sisters of Emiliani House were forced to rely on donations from the religious community, the village shops and local farmers, along with what they grew themselves to feed and clothe the children. I had heard rumours since I could first remember that things had not always been so grim. They once had a wealthy benefactor who supported them well and ensured they had all they needed, often providing additional luxury items they could not afford. I had heard the stories of long ago when they served meat every night and had access to an abundance of food and cloth, a time when every room in the mansion was in use and filled with thriving, happy children. Now that was no longer the case. They did their best, but sometimes that was just not enough. When you were a child shivering at night because the only blanket available to you was so thin it barely provided any warmth. You learned as you got older to put on your nightgown first, then a dress, followed by the thick socks knitted by the sisters. I knew that sleeping cold was another of my lasts. The first thing I was going to buy was a warm blanket to ensure I was cosy and warm every night for the rest of my life, no matter what other necessities I would consequently sacrifice. I stepped into the dormitory, a room filled with so many memories, and a refuge where I had slept for most of my life. An invisible weight lifted from my shoulders as I glanced across at the bed that no longer belonged to me, taking several steps closer to check the drawers of the small side table before opening my calico bag. It contained a nightdress, my new brown dress, a change of bloomers, and 2 pairs of socks. I had packed a solid silver hairbrush and matching hand mirror, a gift from Sister Mary Josephine, who told me it had belonged to her grandmother. I placed her photograph inside the small wooden box with the tiny clothes and precious stone, then slipped it inside the bag, causing it to bulge and strain the stitching. The cook, Mrs. Murphy, had packed me a bag of parritch and several bannocks filled with cheese and pickles to take on my journey, along with a jar of barley water, all of which I also tucked away in the now full bag. I was grateful, but Mrs. Murphy had to be the worst cook in the world, and the sisters knew it, given they too were forced to suffer in silence along with the children. They kept her on out of loyalty, as she had been there forever and was now very old and cantankerous. We learned not to complain about the cold, greasy, tasteless food. I slipped on my bonnet and tied the strap securely under my chin, then picked up the bag, walked to the door, turned, and took one last look at the room that had been the only sleeping place I had known. With one last glance, I strode out into the hallway, promising myself I would never look back. Everyone stood in the front garden, from the very young to the aging sisters, patiently waiting to say goodbye. I hugged several of the children, kissed the hands of many of the sisters, and then went to look for Sister Mary Josephine. I found her standing alongside the castle wall, away from the others, trying to catch her breath from the sobs that were racking her lovely frame. As I approached, she appeared highly distressed, and I felt a sudden pain tear at my heart. It was the most distraught I had ever seen her. I was concerned, reaching across and placing my hand on her shoulder, embracing her, as I whispered gently,
"Sister, I'm leaving now."
She stared into my eyes, anguish evident in her own.
"I cannot let you go, my lord. I feel like my heart is being ripped out ever so slowly."
Tears streamed down her face, her body shaking as she sobbed, unable to be comforted.
"I know I cannot keep you, but I want to. Even though I know it is wrong, I want you to have the best life possible. But if anything bad should have happened or you need help, I beg that you come back and I will find a way to look after you. I will ensure you are safe, no matter what I had to do, even if it means contacting my family after all these years and begging for their help."
I broke down as I hugged her tightly.
"I love you, sister, and I promise that I will be fine. I will write to you as soon as I can. I will miss you every day that we are parted, and someday I will find my way back to you."
She embraced me forcefully before we dried our tears, linking her arm through mine as she led me back to the front of the manor to wait for Mr. Potts and his cart. As he approached, she held my hand tighter, and with fresh tears in her eyes, kissed me on the cheek for what would likely be the last time. Mr. Potts placed my bag on the cart as I squeezed her hand just as tightly, the finality of it all hitting me hard.
Thank you so much for everything,"
I whispered, kissing her one final time before I stepped up and sat next to Mr. Potts on the uncomfortable bench seat of the old wooden carriage that had seen better days. As we slowly pulled away, I looked back and saw them waving to me. Sister Mary Josephine stood at the front, sobbing while flapping her arm in the air in farewell. I waved back with tears trickling down my face. I would never forget this place, my home for 15 long years. It had provided me with shelter, food and love, and now the only security I had ever known had been permanently taken from me. I knew not a soul in the world, a world that loomed around me like a formidable giant. I had no idea what would ultimately befall me beyond the walls of the orphanage. But I knew I now had something to hold on to, a glimmer of hope of being reunited with my parents, which was more than I had yesterday. What this solicitor, Mr. Henry Malcolm, wanted from someone like me had me flabbergasted. But whatever it was, must be of some importance to summon me all the way to London. I knew I could drive myself mad by dwelling on all possibilities, sighing deeply as I pushed my unwanted thoughts to the back of my mind. I gazed across the peat fields for the last time as Mr. Potts guided Tipple slowly toward the train station, the soft ground making it difficult for the poor horse as he snorted, sweat starting to lather around his neck and shoulders as he continued to strain. The road soon became firmer as he slowly made his way towards Edinburgh on the winding dirt track, picking up his pace. Turning my face up towards the dark and threatening sky, I promised myself I would not lose hope, no matter what lay ahead of me. I raised my chin further and closed my eyes, the icy breeze cutting into my skin like razor blades, and wrapped my shawl a little tighter around my shoulders, then let out a deep sigh, leaving behind all that I had ever known. Chapter 3. Mr. Tipple stood quietly beside the station house at the rear of the elaborate building, lathered in sweat. Mr. Potts jumped down from the rickety carriage, then extended his hand up towards me. As I passed my bag to him, my dress caught on the seat and the hem tore.
"Typical,"
I muttered. Mr. Potts' mouth twitched as he handed back my one possession in the world the moment my feet hit the ground. "Well then, lass, good luck to you," he said gruffly, avoiding eye contact before tipping his woolen cap politely, then climbing back up on the cart. I was surprised that he had spoken to me at all.
"Thank you, Mr. Potts, and good luck to you too,"
I replied, smiling up at him. I lifted my bag and headed toward the platform where the train waited, following behind several people headed in the same direction, not one of them noticing when I quickly undid the strap of my bonnet and threw it on the ground without even pausing to look back. I held the ticket in my hand, and as I rounded the corner of the ornately decorated building, I caught sight of the passenger train with its enormous steam engine. It was overwhelming to see one up close, let alone the thought of riding inside all the way to London town. The black body of the train with red trimming gleamed as the whistle shriek caused me to jump in fright, while nearly rupturing my eardrums, prompting me to pick up my pace as I moved forward. A pleasant-looking man, dressed in a conductor's uniform, stood beside the train, glancing down briefly as he held open the door to one of the carriages. I entered, quickly sitting down next to a substantial woman who took up half my seat, holding a large basket on her lap. The seats arranged in rows of wooden benches, all facing the same way toward the front of the train, were hard and uncomfortable. My companion was sweating profusely under the weight of her thick winter coat and eyeing me suspiciously. Gripped her bag even tighter, perhaps expecting that any moment I would run off with it. The carriage reeked of chicken feces, sweat, and various animal aromas. I tried to hold my breath as I eyed the passengers who carried their livestock with them. Judging by the mingling odours that continued to violate my senses, I concluded that many of them had not washed in a very long time. Although we bathed only once a week at the orphanage, we were expected to wash daily. I was grateful to the sisters for caring and taking the time each day to make sure that we presented ourselves at our best. They would always say that we may be poor, but we can keep our bodies and our clothes clean and smelling nice, like the Lord intended. We didn't have perfume soap, but a coarse substance that the sisters made themselves, lard being the primary ingredient. From today forward, I would no longer refer to any of the sisters formally, by using their generic name of Mary, as we had been forced to do. I could now call my beloved nun just Sister Josephine, and would do the same for all of them, suddenly feeling empowered by the mere thought. The conductor approached me, his face thoughtful. "May I see your ticket, please, lass?" I handed it to him, surprise crossing his face as I felt my stomach drop. Sorry, but you're in the wrong carriage. If you care to come with me, I will take you to the right one," he informed me cheerfully. I managed to squeeze past my large companion, who grunted at me for the inconvenience. I picked up my bag, which the conductor took from me with a warm smile, before I followed him up the aisle through the next 3 carriages. The last carriage contained spacious compartments with large padded bench seats facing each other, roomy enough to accommodate 6 adults easily. He escorted me inside, where I found a young man and woman about my age sitting on one side, and on the other a pretty child with ringlets tied with pink ribbons, whom I quickly sat beside. They all had blonde hair and were dressed in expensive clothes and were beautiful to behold. The young woman emitted a soft golden glow around her body that I noticed immediately. It had shocked me, as I had seen that glow before, but I had assumed it was only because of the deep love I held for Sister and Polly. The first time I had observed such a glow was around Sister Josephine, when she held me as a baby. It was a faint glow that surrounded her body, which became stronger as I grew older. I once told her about it, and she said it was never to be spoken of again and was of the devil himself. Polly's glow was no different than the one I saw around Sister Josephine. I did not know what it signified, but looking back, they were the two people who meant the most to me. Although Sister Monica had an aura, it was not golden. It was a dark, dirty grey that swirled around her when she was angry with me. I was confused by it. I could only assume the grey aura was sinister, based on how it made me feel. The opposite feeling of joy, settling on me when in the presence of the golden glow, surrounded the two people I cherished most. The thought of Polly making my heart hurt. For the first 6 months after Polly had gone, I remembered how I'd hoped for a letter from her as she'd promised, but nothing ever came. I cried myself to sleep many a night, praying that Polly was happy and safe, that she had warm blankets and a comfortable place to live and sleep. I wondered what role this young woman with the golden glow would play in my life, as we were only going to spend today together. I shifted on the plush seat and made myself comfortable, turning to gaze out the window as the train started to move, watching the buildings slowly disappear and the countryside come into view. Soon, the silence in the compartment became too uncomfortable to bear.
Hello, my name is Abigail. Abigail, Delmont.
I addressed the young man, while I assumed his companions were his younger sisters. The young woman, who could have been a little older than me, looked shy. She sat motionless with her head lowered, her straight blonde hair falling down the sides of her face, avoiding eye contact with everyone present. Their younger sister was around 10 and greeted me back, smiling wildly at me. The young man glared across at me and scowled, causing my stomach to drop while making me feel awkward and uncomfortable all at once.
What makes a person like you think you can travel with people like us? It isn't obvious as a grimy nose on your face. You've never travelled first class before. You do not even have a hat or a bonnet to cover your hair.
Then, glaring at me, screwed up his face in disdain.
I have never travelled on a train in my whole life, let alone first class,
I calmly stated, my face becoming warm while anger and humiliation rose inside me.
Nor have I come across anyone as rude or as arrogant as you, sir. Where I come from, we don't judge people based on their appearance or the clothes they wear, but by their character and the kindness they show through their words and actions.
This was all I needed on my first day in the real world. It was just my poor luck that the first person I was forced to become acquainted with was a snobbish young man who appeared intent on making me feel bad about myself. I felt frightened and intimidated by the changes that were occurring through no fault of my own, and it was overwhelming that I was now responsible for myself when I still felt like a child. The young man gazed across at me with disdain.
Do not even try pretending to be like your betters. It's offensive,
he barked, eyeing the ragged tear in my dress before glaring back at me.
You're well spoken, I'll give you that, and English, I see. However, you look like you come from a workhouse. Look at your hands, and your dress is torn. Surely you know how to mend. You look as if you've lived as a scullery maid since the age of 5.
I could feel my temper rising, but embarrassed, I hid my work-worn hands from view. I knew I should keep quiet, but this privileged young man had no idea I had been raised in an orphanage, and, although sheltered, I had seen and heard people talk roughly outside the taverns in the village. He continued to glare at me, the anger I felt finally exploding into pure rage.
You are no gentleman, and are certainly not my better, in character or manner. trying to make me feel bad about myself just because my clothes are not as fine as yours reflects on you rather than me. I suggest you bend over backwards and slip that ignorant head of yours up that refined ass you so proudly sit on, no doubt rarely getting off it to do anything for anyone other than yourself. You may well locate a brain somewhere in there if you look hard enough, but I doubt that very much, you condescending funt.
I watched intently as he jerked back like I'd slapped him, glaring across at me, hatred filling his eyes while he remained silent, his mouth opening and closing several times. The fact he appeared speechless brightened my mood immensely. Finally, I turned and looked out the window, making myself comfortable as I prepared for the long journey ahead in silence. You could hear a pin drop in the compartment, the train rocking comfortably as it glided along the tracks at great speed, until the young woman lifted her head and looked directly into my eyes. She smiled at me, her smile becoming wide before she giggled, a faint sound that turned into a musical laugh.
"That was an obvious message to be nice, William," she remarked to the young man, before turning to me, her smile still radiant. "I don't think I've ever heard anyone talk to Mr. Self-Importance here like that before. My name is Catherine, and this mean fellow is my brother William, and here is our younger sister Beatrice."
She was beaming, her golden blonde hair falling just below her shoulders, her beautiful pale blue eyes reflecting her mirth. She was finely built, very pretty, and had the sweetest smile.
"We are travelling to London to catch a ship and migrate to Australia to be with our parents. Where are you going?"
I explained I was meeting my parents in London and that we planned to settle there. My explanation seemed to appease them, and they were starting to relax with me, despite William giving me the odd look of disgust from time to time. Of course, I knew it was a white lie, but it could still be possible that this solicitor business was about meeting my parents, and, until I knew for certain, that was what I chose to believe. I pulled my bag onto my lap and dug around inside before I triumphantly produced the cheese and pickle bannock. The only thing I would miss about the orphanage food would be the fresh bread filled with cheese the sisters crafted themselves. Pickles they would simmer for days into a sauce, all wrapped up in the fresh flatbread. I offered half to William, who turned his head away from me dismissively and stared out the window. Catherine, however, took the half with great pleasure and broke some off for Beatrice, who thanked me. As the three of us enjoyed our morning tea, Catherine told me about herself and her family. They lived in Scotland at their grandparents' estate for the past year, as their parents had sailed to Australia to start up a fashion business in Melbourne. Their father had become wealthy by pursuing his passion and becoming a tailor, who discovered he enjoyed creating dresses for beautiful women, given he had more opportunities to use his creative flair than make boring menswear. He imported the most glorious materials from all over the world to make into exclusive, fashionable women's clothing. He had owned a store in High Street, London, named Montague's, to which women would come from far and wide to purchase his stunning creations. He was what they called in Paris a designer. He prided himself on producing exquisite gowns just as good, if not better, than those found in France, and one-off creations for those in society who could afford his prices. He wanted to give his children a better lifestyle away from the hustle and bustle of London, Catherine had told me proudly. A friend advised him there were no businesses like his in Australia, where there were many wealthy women who would pay any price to have the latest fashions at their fingertips rather than send to Paris for them, a costly months-long experience. Their father had purchased land in Melbourne and was building a grand house. However, their parents were living over his large shop at this present time. In his letters, he stated that although not extravagant, the quarters were large and spacious enough for their whole family until their new home was completed. While she talked, Catherine noticed that her brother had fallen asleep. She shared that William was reluctant to go since he viewed Australia as a place filled with convicts born and second-class citizens. This, she whispered secretively, had contributed to his bad temper and rudeness, for which she apologised repeatedly. She believed, but had no proof that William secretly had a sweetheart, which was the real reason he did not want to leave. Catherine and Beatrice were non-committal about the move, leaning toward muted excitement. They had heard stories of the great ocean and the sunshine, beautiful mountains, and the friendliness of the Australians.
That should take William down a peg or two, going from a castle to an apartment above a shop.
Catherine giggled wickedly as she brushed a loose strand of hair from her eyes.
Don't take it personally what he said before. I think you look lovely and you're beautiful. I have never seen eyes of such a deep green before, or hair of that colour. It's as if you have 10 different shades of red and copper in your hair. It's so thick and long. I would give anything to be blessed with curls like yours.
I felt ashamed for what I had said to her brother in anger, but thanked her and advised her that in no way was I damaged by William's words. Catherine moved closer and settled herself beside me so we could talk discreetly, while Beatrice moved across to sit by William. They had been raised by nannies, as their father and mother were far too busy with their business and social calendar to spend much time with their children. They had lived on an estate just outside London, with a house full of servants that included maids, nannies, tutors, a gardener, and Rover, their red setter, that they were forced to leave behind. They had been provided with private tutors and were taught the correct ways to behave in high society. Catherine hated that William relished the fact that they were wealthy and truly believed he was better than others. As she described her life, I started to think her childhood resembled my own, the only difference being she had had warm blankets, food, and a surname. I could hear rattling coming closer, a loud knock sounding before the door was flung open. I turned towards the door to see a server standing next to a trolley laden with food and drink, the sudden interruption rousing William from his sleep.
Good afternoon, and a bonny one 'tis at that. I hope you're all peckish, as here's your lunch. Would you also like dessert?
She smiled as she waited patiently. We nodded and thanked her as she served us beef stew with mashed potatoes and crannikin for dessert. The meat melted in my mouth, and the creamy potato had so much butter in it, I felt like I was in heaven. At the orphanage, we were rarely given butter, as it was served to the sisters first, and if any remained by the next morning, only then was it given to the children, which was rare. I loved butter and would eat it on anything and everything when I had the chance. There was something about its creamy texture, subtle saltiness and lovely creamy flavour that set my taste buds dancing. We had finished our lunch and were about to start our dessert when the woman returned, just as suddenly as when she first appeared. "What can I get you to drink, my wee bairns?" She rattled off our options one by one, smiling fondly at us. As soon as I heard her mention coffee, I knew I must try it. I had read so much about it, how it grew in far-off lands, was harvested, dried, and then transported all over the world. I placed my order and turned back to the window. The countryside was flying past, and I could see blurry cows and trees, and it appeared an icy wind was blowing. I was so grateful to be warm and cosy in this compartment, enjoying Catherine's company. As I sipped the glorious beverage called coffee, Catherine and I talked all afternoon while Beatrice and William slept. It was the first time I felt drawn to another person my age since Polly had left the orphanage. Catherine still had that soft golden glow around her, and I wondered if I was right. The people I saw with this glow became close to me. I hoped so, as I liked Catherine. The golden aura that surrounded her was a mystery to me, yet one I wanted to explore. I could tell she was a kind girl with a childhood not unlike my own, and although talkative, she appeared nervous and did not seem to have a great deal of confidence. Although seemingly relaxed with me, she would often drop her gaze and not hold eye contact for long. I wondered at what stage of her life she had come to believe that she was less of a person than the others, and I found her situation saddening, as she truly was one of the nicest people I had met. I soon felt the need for a nap, and as I drifted off to sleep, wrapped in a thick blanket the lovely lunch lady had provided, I thought how blessed I was. Despite my upbringing, I had blossomed into an outspoken, confident person. I had Sister Josephine to thank for that, for she was always telling me I was special, that I would continue to be unique even when I grew up, and that I was worthy of love. Most of the sisters had kind hearts. However, there were those who took great pleasure in mistreating the children they were obligated to love and protect. I shoved the awful memories to the back of my mind, as I always did when I didn't want to think about something. As sleep came, the last thing I remembered was a feeling of being encased in warm, soft leaves and laying in the sunshine in a far-off land, gazing at a sky so blue you only ever saw it in your dreams. If you would like to read more, go to jlmartinauthor.com to download your free ebook or buy the full audiobook on your chosen platform.